Have you ever dreamed of being a king or queen, wearing golden crowns, eating fancy feasts, and living in a giant stone castle? Sounds perfect, until you find out that royalty didn't even have toilets, or privacy, or soap. In this video, you will discover that being royal in the Middle Ages was less like a fairy tale and more like a bizarre, full-time job you couldn't quit. So get cozy, take a deep breath, and let yourself drift into sleep while we explore the weirdest parts of royal life in medieval times. Royal life looked majestic from the outside. The castles, the power, the attention, everything seemed perfect. But under the surface, kings and queens dealt with problems most of us can't imagine. For starters, hygiene. Bathing was rare, very rare. Many royals believed that water could make you sick. They thought hot water opened your skin and let diseases in. Queen Isabella of Castile was proud of bathing only twice in her entire life, once at birth and once before marriage. Perfumes tried to cover the smell, but they didn't fool anyone. The result? Beautiful people, in beautiful clothes, smelling absolutely terrible. And those clothes, they looked amazing but felt awful. Royal robes were heavy, hot, and itchy. Dressing took hours. A single outfit could weigh more than your weekend suitcase. Every color, every fabric had meaning. Purple meant royalty. Fur meant money. But all that symbolism couldn't save you from the weight, sweat, and discomfort of layers upon layers of itchy fabric. Then there was sleep. Royals didn't sleep alone. Their beds were large, but often shared, not just with their spouse, but with servants, bodyguards, and even advisors. Privacy didn't exist. Even the royal marriage night wasn't private. In some kingdoms, witnesses, yes, real people, had to confirm that the couple actually consummated the marriage. It was like living in a soap opera with no commercial breaks. Feasts were grand, but also strange. Royals ate swans, peacocks, and pies filled with live birds. Food was a performance. Taste came second. After these meals, kings often felt so sick they needed help just to walk. Herbal drinks, tight belts, and personal servants were needed just to manage digestion. And remember, there were no forks. Most people ate with their hands or with knives. Imagine trying to eat a goose with no napkins and no proper cutlery. And after all that food, time for the toilet. But not a nice, modern bathroom. Castles had garderobes, stone seats over pits that dropped waste outside the walls. No flushing, no privacy, and the smell, unforgettable. Some kings preferred chamber pots, fancy bowls used as portable toilets. Servants had to empty them. That was someone's full-time job. Children of royalty didn't have it much better. Princes and princesses were raised by nurses, not their parents. Love wasn't part of royal parenting. Kids were tools for politics, marriage deals, alliances, and heirs. A royal child might be sent away at 5 years old to be raised in another kingdom. Their life belonged to the crown, not to themselves. Even walking had rules. Royals had to walk slowly, with perfect posture, and always with purpose. Tripping could be seen as a bad omen, or a sign of weakness. Everything was symbolic. How you walked, how you spoke, even how you held your cup. There was a correct way to do it. Break the rules, and you might cause a diplomatic disaster. Etiquette ruled everything. You had to know where to sit, when to speak, how to bow, and what not to touch. Forgetting even one rule could lead to embarrassment, or worse. That's why some royals had special advisors just to whisper etiquette reminders during events. Imagine needing a human cheat sheet just to attend dinner. And then, of course, there was the constant fear of poisoning, of rebellion, of being overthrown. Royals couldn't trust anyone, not even their own family. Betrayal was common. Siblings turned on each other. Children were used as pawns. Marriages were political strategies, not love stories. Every smile could be a lie. Every toast, a trap. The truth is, being royal in medieval times meant living in a cage made of gold. Yes, you had wealth and power, but you also had no freedom. Your life was scheduled, observed, judged. You couldn't choose who to marry. You couldn't decide what to eat. You couldn't even sneeze without someone writing it down in a royal logbook. So next time you daydream about being a king or queen, think twice. Think about the chamber pots, the itchy robes, the sleepless nights, and the constant pressure to be perfect. Royal life wasn't magical. It was stressful, awkward, and weird. But at least it makes a good bedtime story. Let us go deeper into the strange details of royal life that didn't make it into the fairy tales. Medicine, for instance, was more terrifying than helpful. Medieval royals had access to the best doctors of their time, and yet most treatments involved things like bloodletting, leeches, and herbal pastes made with animal parts. If a king had a fever, a doctor might cut his arm to let the bad blood out. If a queen had a headache, she might be advised to inhale the smoke of burnt herbs, or worse, cow dung mixed with vinegar. The idea of germs didn't exist. Illness was blamed on imbalances of bodily fluids, bad air, or even sin. So, being treated could be more dangerous than being sick, and death was everywhere. Even royal families faced high infant mortality, deadly infections, and sudden accidents. A small wound could turn fatal. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. And the plague? It didn't care about titles. During the Black Death, entire noble households were wiped out. Castles that once echoed with music and laughter became silent tombs. Imagine being surrounded by luxury, but knowing that no one, not even a king, was safe from invisible death. Religion controlled every corner of royal life. From birth to death, everything had to follow church customs. Even meals began with prayers and ended with blessings. Certain foods were forbidden on holy days, and intimate relations. The church had rules for that too. When, how, and even with whom. Marriage wasn't just a political tool. It was a sacred ritual, and breaking the rules could lead to excommunication. Royals lived under constant pressure to appear morally perfect, even if their private lives were anything but. Dreams and omens were taken seriously. If a royal dreamed of snakes, it might be seen as a sign of betrayal. A bird flying into a room could mean war. A broken mirror, terrible luck. Kings often had court astrologers, or mystics who read the stars, interpreted dreams, and gave warnings. Major decisions, like battles or marriages, might be delayed because the moon wasn't in the right position. Logic took a backseat to superstition. Time itself felt different in royal life. There were no clocks like today. Time was marked by bells, candle lengths, or the position of the sun. The royal day started at sunrise and ended at sunset. with long breaks in between for meals, meetings, and ceremonies. And everything moved slowly, very slowly. A simple letter could take weeks to arrive. News of an invasion might travel slower than the invaders. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. And while royalty had wealth, they didn't exactly have spending freedom. Kings had to get approval from councils or parliaments before spending on wars, weddings, or even repairs. Queens often had household allowances and were expected to manage them wisely. If they overspent, they faced public criticism. That's right, royal budgeting scandals aren't new. Even in the 1300s, people grumbled about how much gold was being spent on clothes and jewels. Entertainment was both extravagant and odd. There were jesters who performed ridiculous acts, musicians who played medieval instruments, and even royal dwarfs kept for amusement. Masks, early versions of theater, were filled with elaborate costumes, strange symbolism, and moral lessons. Sometimes, wild animals were brought into court for spectacle. Lions, bears, even elephants, though few survived long in European climates. These displays were meant to show power, but they often ended in disaster. And let's talk about beauty. Standards were strict and strange. Pale skin was prized because it showed you didn't work outdoors. So women, especially queens and noble ladies, used white lead paint on their faces. It looked elegant, but it was toxic. Over time, it ruined skin and caused illness. Thin eyebrows, high foreheads, and no visible body hair were considered beautiful, so hairlines were plucked, eyelashes shaved, and natural features hidden. Beauty came at a painful cost. Language was another weird part of royal life. In some courts, the king and queen didn't even speak the same native language. Royals married across borders, and communication became a mix of broken Latin, French, Spanish, or German. Misunderstandings were common and sometimes dangerous. A mistranslated phrase could insult a foreign dignitary or lead to diplomatic tension. That's why interpreters and scribes were crucial. Words mattered more than weapons. As strange as all this sounds, one truth remains. Medieval royalty lived under constant pressure to be flawless, to be symbolic, to be powerful, but restrained. Every step they took, every word they spoke, every outfit they wore, every person they looked at, everything had meaning. They were watched not just by their courts, but by entire kingdoms. The weight of an entire nation rested on their shoulders. And yet, in the quiet corners of their massive castles, behind the thick stone walls and heavy tapestries, they were still human. They got tired, they got scared, they laughed at bad jokes, they argued with their families, they loved, they grieved, they hoped. Underneath the crown, they were just people, stuck in a strange role they never truly chose. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. The life of a medieval king or queen was not one of freedom, peace, or even real comfort. It was a rigid, awkward, ceremonial existence, full of strange rules, questionable hygiene, and endless expectations. Royal, yes, but restful? Not at all. Sleep well knowing you don't. To have to wake up at sunrise for a 7-hour ceremony in a freezing hall. Your bed is yours. Your thoughts are private. And your life, thankfully, is not controlled by medieval etiquette scrolls. While most people in the medieval world woke up to the sound of animals or church bells and went straight to physical labor, royal mornings began with ceremony. Waking up wasn't just a personal act, it was a public one. The king didn't roll out of bed and stretch. He was woken gently, often by soft music or whispered greetings. Servants entered the room in a carefully practiced order, carrying robes, water, and sometimes even religious relics, depending on the day. The ritual of getting dressed was not about comfort or speed. It was about meaning. Each garment, from undertunic to cloak, had its own significance. The king's underclothes were often handled by trusted attendants only. Layers were added slowly, with pauses between them, as if the act of dressing were a spiritual transformation. The final touch, perhaps a ring, a sash, or a piece of armor, marked that he was ready to be seen, and therefore ready to exist in his royal identity. Meals, too, had their own rhythm. Breakfast was rarely eaten alone. Nobles were expected to be present for a light morning meal, which might include bread, cheese, or broth. But again, it wasn't about hunger. It was about presence. Being seen at the right time, in the right way, said everything about your status. Skipping a meal without explanation could be viewed as a political signal. Eating quietly was a form of strength. Even chewing was done with care. The rest of the morning was often filled with meetings. Long, slow, structured affairs. Royal councils moved at a glacial pace. Decisions were rarely made quickly. Every suggestion, even a minor one, had to pass through layers of opinion and tradition. If a new tax was proposed, or a trade agreement considered, it might take days just to choose the language that would be used to discuss it. Silence was common in these rooms. Pauses between sentences were measured. Speaking too soon was a sign of youth or foolishness. The older and more powerful a noble was, the slower he tended to speak. And when nothing urgent was happening, there was waiting. Royals spent much of their lives waiting. Waiting for news. Waiting for guests. Waiting for signs from the heavens. Time moved slowly inside stone walls. The days stretched on, not because there was too much to do, but because every action had to be spaced out, like candles along a corridor. Too many events in one afternoon would be considered chaotic, even dangerous. So, the hours passed with long walks, whispered conversations, or simply sitting still in silence. Occasionally, entertainment would arrive. A musician with a harp, a monk with a story, a scholar with a map. But even entertainment had to follow formality. There was a right way to laugh, a right way to nod, even a right way to request more music. A royal smile could be analyzed for days. Was it approval? Was it mockery? Was it boredom? No one could be sure, so they watched carefully, trying to read meaning into every gesture. Outside the walls, the world was full of movement and noise, but inside, royalty lived like statues, beautiful, guarded, and still. Even reading was a performance. If a king chose to read, it wasn't curled up with a book. It was seated at a carved desk, with scribes nearby, taking note of anything he might say aloud. Books were rare and expensive, often made by hand. Turning each page required delicacy. Owning a dozen books was a sign of enormous wealth. And even those books weren't for pleasure. They were for religion, law, or diplomacy. Afternoons sometimes included walks in the castle gardens, if weather allowed. But these walks weren't leisurely. They followed set paths, with specific stops, perhaps to pray near a statue, or to be seen by certain guests at a distance. A royal stroll was more like a parade. Servants walked behind. Nobles flanked the sides. Everyone moved at the same speed, in silence, unless spoken to. Even nature bowed to the script. Letters and messages arrived with slow, deliberate pace. A writer might bring a sealed scroll that had traveled for weeks. The seal would be inspected, the handwriting recognized. Then, if it passed all the tests of authenticity, it might be read aloud by a scribe. Royals didn't read their own letters unless they had to. Reading was a sign of work. Listening was a sign of authority. So the king listened, nodded, and issued short replies, also written by others. Evening approached with more ritual. Dinner was not just a meal. It was a performance of rank. Where you sat mattered. What you ate mattered. Some nobles were allowed bread with honey, others were not. Some drank wine from goblets, others from wooden cups. Everyone watched, and everyone was watched. Conversation was controlled. Humor was dangerous. Laughter could draw unwanted attention. A single story told in the wrong tone might echo in rumors for weeks. As night approached, preparations for rest began early. The royal bed had to be aired, examined, and sometimes even blessed, depending on the mood of the court. Candles were placed at specific intervals. Curtains were drawn, not just for privacy, but to block bad spirits. Some kings slept with relics under their pillows, pieces of saints, small crosses, or written prayers. These weren't superstitions, they were necessities. Without them, the royal mind couldn't rest. Sleep was not guaranteed. Some royals lay awake for hours, listening to the wind outside, or the occasional whisper of a servant nearby. Insomnia was common, though no one called it that. It was just the royal burden. When sleep did come, it was light and uncertain. At any moment, someone might knock. A messenger might arrive. A war might begin. So even in sleep, royalty lived on edge, and when morning came, the whole cycle began again. Not with freedom, not with joy, but with form, repetition, and weight. Being royal wasn't about ruling. It was about performing a version of yourself that others expected to see every single day, without pause. And perhaps that's what made it so exhausting. Even now, centuries later, those stone walls remain, cold, still, watching, and within them, echoes of footsteps that once followed patterns so precise they could have been carved in the floor itself. Not all royals were content with this quiet, ceremonial life. Some found ways to escape it, not by leaving the castle, but by withdrawing into smaller rooms, hidden corners, or long walks alone. Within some palaces, there were private libraries, small chapels, or enclosed gardens, meant only for the royal family. These were not places for politics, but for breathing. It was in these hidden spaces that a queen might write poetry no one would ever read, or a prince might carve initials into stone walls out of boredom or longing. Music sometimes filled these quiet places. Royals, who could play instruments, found a rare sense of control in melodies. A lute, a harp, a flute. These were not tools of power, but of peace. And yet, even music had to be chosen carefully. Certain melodies were considered inappropriate for specific seasons. A cheerful song in Lent? Too scandalous. Even joy was subject to regulation. Holidays brought a change in pace, but not necessarily relief. Religious festivals required participation. There were processions to lead, masses to attend, hands to kiss. A royal's presence was required at every holy event, no matter how exhausted or uninterested they felt. Being absent wasn't an option. Faith was public, and so was devotion. In contrast, days of mourning were equally demanding. If a noble relative died, the court entered a period of silence. Music was banned, colors changed, black cloth covered furniture. Even speech became limited. Smiling during mourning was seen as a terrible offense. Grief had to be expressed exactly as expected, or not at all, and marriage, the central axis of royal life, was often the strangest part of all. Royal weddings were rarely about love. They were alliances sealed in velvet and gold. A bride might be married by proxy, meaning she said her vows to a knight holding a sword in place of the groom, who was still in another country. Some royal couples met for the first time on their wedding day. Others met only after the wedding night. The idea of choosing a partner for compatibility was almost unheard of. Bloodlines and treaties mattered more than affection. Life after marriage didn't always improve. Queens were expected to produce heirs as soon as possible. If a child didn't come quickly, suspicion fell on the woman. She was questioned, examined, and sometimes even replaced. In rare cases, marriages were annulled, not for infidelity, but for infertility. A queen's worth was measured by her womb, and the pressure didn't stop after the first child. More heirs meant more security for the dynasty, but more children also meant more risk. Childbirth was dangerous. Many queens died, giving birth to their fourth, fifth, or sixth child, and each death echoed through the kingdom, not just as a personal loss, but as a political crisis. Meanwhile, kings aged under a different kind of pressure. Their bodies became symbols. A limping king meant a weakened kingdom. A coughing king sparked rumors of invasion. Every sign of aging had to be hidden. Teeth were replaced with false ones made of ivory or bone. Hair was powdered. Faces were painted. The image of power mattered more than the reality. Even death had to be managed with precision. A royal dying couldn't simply pass away in peace. There were rituals, words to be spoken, witnesses to be summoned. Last breaths were recorded, last words remembered, or sometimes invented. The royal body had to be cleaned, dressed, and displayed, often for days, while the court wept on cue. And then, of course, came the burial, another elaborate ceremony. Some kings were buried with crowns on their heads. Others had their hearts removed and buried separately, often in a chapel far from the body. Some were sealed in stone tombs beneath cathedrals. Others were placed in ornate coffins, layered with symbols, relics, and parchment. But no matter the method, the message was the same. Even in death, the royal performance continued, and so we return to the same truth, echoed again and again in the life of medieval royalty. Everything was a symbol. Everything had meaning. Nothing was ever just simple or natural. Not eating, not dressing, not sleeping, not even dying. Life was not lived freely. It was carried out step by step as a ritual, a pageant, a burden wrapped in silk. And it is in this quiet, ceremonial stillness that the story begins to slow, like a candle burning low in a dark corridor. The air is still, the castle walls remain, and the footsteps of long-forgotten monarchs echo quietly through the stone halls. One slow step at a time. If there was one thing that defined the rhythm of a royal life in medieval times, it was ceremony. Ceremonies didn't just mark the major events, like births, coronations, or weddings. They were embedded in the ordinary, woven into the very act of existence. The line between daily habit and sacred ritual had blurred so deeply that simply walking into a room could become a coded message. Every appearance by a king or queen was a performance, and every subject was part of the audience. Whether the monarch spoke, remained silent, looked pleased, or merely blinked slowly, it all carried weight. Even moods became political. A smile might reassure the court. A sigh could start rumors. A frown could shake alliances. Nothing could be said plainly. Nothing could go unnoticed. That's why ceremonies were so carefully designed. They were scripted, timed, rehearsed, sometimes for weeks. The act of receiving a guest, for instance, involved a series of doors, hallways, titles, bows, and phrases. The more important the visitor, the longer it took to reach the royal presence, not as a sign of respect, but as a reminder of distance. The coronation of a monarch was perhaps the most dramatic of all rituals. It wasn't just about putting a crown on someone's head. It involved sacred oils, ancient prayers, relics, and music played on instruments that might be heard only once in a generation. Every part of the body had to be anointed in a particular order. Every object, from scepter to sword, had to be presented with exact words, and when the crown finally touched the royal brow, it wasn't just a symbol of power. It was believed to change the person beneath it. And yet, despite all this grandeur, fear was never far away. The power of the crown came with paranoia. The more public the ceremony, the more exposed the monarch. That's why guards lined the walls, tasted the food, and examined the candles for poison hidden in wax. The same people cheering one day could revolt the next. Even the loudest applause sounded, to a careful ear, like the opening of a trap. Superstition filled the gaps where logic failed. Royals, like everyone else, believed in signs. A sudden gust of wind during a speech might be interpreted as divine disapproval. A flickering candle before a treaty could be taken as an omen of betrayal. Advisors often consulted astrological charts before major decisions. Entire wars were delayed because Venus was in the wrong position. Relics were more than sacred. They were essential tools of royal authority. A splinter from the cross, a lock of a saint's hair, even bones or ashes, were kept in ornate containers and displayed during times of unrest. Holding one of these relics while making a speech was believed to add divine weight to the words. Some kings slept with them under their pillows. Others carried them into battle. The lines between church and crown were blurry. Monarchs were crowned by bishops, and in some cases were seen as having been chosen by God. But this divine appointment also came with divine expectations. Sins were political risks. Failures could be seen as signs of spiritual weakness. That's why confession wasn't just a private act. It was sometimes strategic. A king might confess a sin publicly to appear humble, or hide one to maintain an illusion of strength. Holy days were filled with processions. The streets would be cleared, flowers thrown, incense burned. Royals moved slowly, robes trailing behind them, flanked by clergy and nobles. Every eye watched. Every gesture was judged. Even children along the roads were coached on how to bow properly. If someone failed to kneel at the right moment, they might be dragged away and punished. Reverence wasn't optional. It was enforced. Marriage ceremonies, too, were rich with strange rituals. Vows were spoken in Latin, even if neither bride nor groom understood the words. Rings were blessed with water and herbs. In some traditions, the The couple's hands were literally tied together, where the term tying the knot comes from. The kiss, often romanticized today, was not for passion. It was a seal of contract, performed in front of witnesses with careful timing, and when a royal child was born, the event became a public matter immediately. The Queen gave birth, surrounded not by doctors, but by dozens of court officials, midwives, and witnesses. Privacy was impossible. There had to be proof that the child was indeed royal and indeed alive. Immediately after birth, the infant might be whisked away to be weighed, bathed, and examined for signs, a birthmark, a cry, a movement that could be interpreted in countless ways. Baptisms were theatrical, water from sacred springs, prayers chanted in echoing chapels, a dozen godparents all wearing ceremonial garments. Even the name had to be chosen carefully, often after negotiation between noble houses, religious leaders, and astrologers. A name wasn't just a name, it was a message. And then there were royal deaths, more than just a moment of mourning. They were entire productions. Bells rang for days. The body was displayed on a platform surrounded by candles. Nobles arrived in layers of black silk. The air smelled of wax and rosewater, mixed with something darker. Whispered eulogies were delivered with exact pacing. Crying too soon was considered suspicious. Crying too late was offensive. Some nobles even hired mourners to make sure their grief looked convincing. Even the burial had rules. The position of the tomb, the materials, the inscriptions. Some kings chose to be buried with books, others with swords. Some asked for plain graves to show humility. Others built massive monuments with statues meant to impress the living more than to honor the dead. And if the king died without an heir, chaos began. Ceremonies turned into power plays. Crowns passed between hands. Promises were broken. In these moments, tradition became a weapon, and every rule of ceremony became a tool of survival. So why did they do it all? Why live in such exhausting detail? Why perform life as if it were a never-ending stage play? Because power, in the Middle Ages, was about belief. You weren't powerful because of armies or money alone. You were powerful because people believed you were meant to rule. And to make them believe, you had to act the part, perfectly, constantly, without fail. Even when tired, even when grieving, even when terrified. Ceremony was armor. Superstition was structure. Rituals were ropes that held the kingdom together. And so, the days passed, heavy with meaning, slow as candle wax, unchanging as stone. 1,000 tiny gestures, all adding up to something bigger, or maybe to nothing at all. Beyond the public ceremonies, there were rituals of secrecy, quiet traditions kept out of sight, passed down through whispers rather than documents. For some royal families, these involved secret symbols carved into the walls of private chapels or coded phrases exchanged between siblings. Certain corridors and castles were believed to carry echoes differently, and so were used for delicate conversations. Other halls were avoided entirely, said to be haunted by kings who had died without heirs. This quiet superstition wasn't always spoken aloud, but it lived in the gestures. Salt thrown over shoulders, fingers traced along wood before opening a letter, candles snuffed in a certain order. Even the way a door was closed could carry meaning. Was it closed slowly, firmly, silently? Each variation had its own quiet weight. Ambassadors from other kingdoms noticed. When visiting a foreign court, they studied these Micro-rituals carefully, as if decoding a language. A delayed invitation could mean hostility. An extra cup of wine could suggest alliance. Even the absence of a toast might be taken as insult. It was a world where silence, time, and arrangement spoke louder than voices. And so, every visit from another noble house became a kind of chess match. The greetings, the exchange of gifts, the seating order at banquets, none of it was random. A misplaced chair could trigger suspicion. A gift of silver, when gold was expected, could start a feud. Protocol was both the map and the minefield. You had to step carefully. But beyond the ritual and performance, some royals grew tired. Over time, a few began to resist. Not openly, but in subtle ways. A queen might choose a slightly different fabric for her gown, just to spark quiet gossip. A prince might delay his entrance by minutes to test how far patience would stretch. These were not revolutions. They were sighs in the form of gestures, small rebellions from behind the curtain. For some, the weight of the ceremonial life became unbearable. That's why, from time to time, you'll find records of monarchs retreating, not from their kingdoms, but from their roles, living in remote towers, spending days in libraries, walking alone before sunrise. The crown still rested on their head, but their eyes looked elsewhere, not outward, toward the crowds, but inward, toward something smaller and less visible, because deep beneath all the ritual and power, something quieter stirred, the need to feel real. In a life where every gesture was judged and every word was calculated, authenticity became a rare and precious thing. And that, perhaps, is the deepest irony of royal life in the medieval world. To rule thousands, you had to give up yourself. To be seen by all, you had to be invisible beneath the role. And so, surrounded by gold, guarded by swords, wrapped in tradition, the royal soul sat quietly, hoping for a moment that wasn't scripted, a moment without eyes, a moment without meaning, a moment that simply was. Beneath the layers of velvet, under the golden crowns and embroidered tunics, the royal body was never quite their own. In the Middle Ages, to be born into royalty was not just to inherit land or title, but to become a living symbol. Every inch of the body, every movement, every illness or scar could be seen as an omen, a message, or a warning. The body of a king was not merely flesh, it was myth. It represented strength, order, and divine right. When a monarch stood tall and healthy before the court, the realm felt stable. But if that same king limped, coughed, or paled too much under candlelight, murmurs began, whispers of weakness, speculations of curses, questions of succession. That's why so much effort was placed into managing the royal image, not just through clothes or speech, but through posture, expression, and health rituals that now seem bizarre. There were daily regimens meant to preserve the royal constitution, oils rubbed into the skin, mixtures of honey and vinegar for the throat, and controlled exposure to sunlight. Some kings believed that a short walk beneath the morning sky kept evil spirits at bay. Others insisted on drinking from specific cups or sleeping with particular herbs tucked inside their pillows. And if something went wrong, if the king fell ill, if the queen fainted, if a royal child had a rash, panic rippled through the palace like a cold wind. Doctors were called. though doctors in this time meant something different. Many were little more than herbalists, mystics, or university-trained theorists who still believed the human body was ruled by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If a king was too angry, they might say his yellow bile was high. If he became melancholic, it was black bile's fault. Treatment often meant restoring balance. That could mean bloodletting, forcing the patient to vomit, or applying heated cups to the skin. Royal physicians used golden instruments and expensive herbs, but that didn't make the outcome any better. Many a monarch died not from illness, but from the cure, and even in death, the royal body remained on display. Long before burial, it had to be prepared. Embalming techniques were rudimentary at best, involving spices, salt, and in some cases, alcohol. Organs were removed and stored separately. The heart might be sent to a chapel in one city, while the body lay in state in another. Sometimes the stomach was buried on its own in yet a third location. It wasn't about medical science. It was symbolism. Each organ had its role. Each space had its purpose. But even while alive, the royal body was rarely allowed to rest. From the moment a prince could stand, he was expected to present himself properly. He was trained to bow, to speak, to sit, all with the precision of someone preparing for constant judgment. If he fidgeted, that was noted. If he looked bored, it became gossip. If he stumbled, it could be seen as divine displeasure. Children in royal families grew up knowing that their very bodies were public objects. Queens faced a different, though equally intense, scrutiny. Their bodies were expected to be vessels of beauty, virtue, and fertility. A queen who did not produce heirs became a political liability, and if she aged too visibly, if her face wrinkled too soon, or her hair thinned, whispers grew louder. She was expected to remain graceful under pressure, elegant while exhausted, and radiant even after childbirth. It was a performance that never ended. To help with this, royal women turned to the strange cosmetics of the time: powders made from crushed pearls, skin whiteners made of vinegar and lead, hair treatments involving lard and ashes. These were not safe. Many of them caused long-term damage. But looking right was not optional. Even pregnancy had its choreography. Once it was announced, the queen often withdrew from public life, retreating to what was called a lying-in chamber. This was a specially prepared room where she would remain for weeks before and after giving birth. It was dimly lit, full of prayers and herbs, meant to protect both mother and child from evil spirits and the dangers of childbirth. Few outsiders were allowed in, sometimes not even the king. Still, despite these measures, many births ended in tragedy, and when they did, the queen was not only expected to grieve, but to do so in a manner that suited her status. Public mourning, specific words, controlled tears, and above all, she had to try again, because the crown demanded it. The royal body could also become a battlefield. Literally, monarchs were expected to lead armies, at least in spirit if not in person. Some did ride into war, clad in armor heavier than most of us could carry. The sight of a king on horseback inspired troops, whether or not he lifted a sword. But armor wasn't just protection, it was message. The medals, the emblems, the way the helmet fit, it all said something about who the king was and what kind of battle he intended to fight. Yet injuries were inevitable, and when a king returned from battle wounded, the court didn't just see blood. They saw omens. If he limped, it could mean a long winter. If he bled from the right side, it was seen as a sign of divine mercy. If from the left, a warning. Superstition filled every gap that medicine could not explain. And if the king died in battle, his body became sacred. It had to be found, recovered, wrapped, carried home with reverence. Each step back was marked by ritual. Each moment became part of the national story. But the strange relationship with the body didn't end there. Certain kings, in later centuries, requested that their bodies be displayed in glass coffins. Others demanded that parts of their skeletons be preserved as relics. One even had his thumb removed and sent to a distant monastery because it had been the finger used to sign a particularly holy decree. To modern eyes, all of this might seem grotesque, theatrical, even absurd, but to the medieval mind, it made perfect sense. The body was not private. It was destiny, duty, drama. It was something to be read, like a book, by nobles, by clergy, by commoners. A pale face could mean a dying kingdom. A bowed back could mean heaven's disapproval. A single scar might tell the story of 100 battles. So they watched, they whispered, they waited, and the royal body, tired and aching, remained. At the center of it all, silent, symbolic, and never truly its own. There is a kind of silence that exists only in castles. It's not peace. It's not comfort. It's a heavy, expectant quiet made of stone and secrets. Behind the thick walls of medieval palaces, royalty lived not just protected, but contained. While the world outside rumbled with trade, war, and weather, inside the palace, time slowed. Movement was measured. Voices were controlled. And every inch of space was soaked in protocol. Royalty didn't move freely. Their steps were mapped. A king did not simply stroll from one room to another. He progressed. He arrived. He was announced. At every door stood a barrier, physical or social, guards, attendants, chamberlains, pages. Even within their own homes, monarchs lived like guests of their own power. It's easy to imagine the grandeur of palaces, golden ceilings, colored glass, windows, vast halls echoing with music. But grandeur wasn't comfort. The walls were cold. The corridors were long. Candles flickered and smoked, staining ceilings black. In winter, drafts crept through stone cracks. And in summer, the heat stuck to the heavy tapestries. A castle was impressive, but rarely pleasant. And yet, royalty was expected to smile, to appear serene, poised, unbothered, even when freezing, even when exhausted, because to show discomfort was to break the illusion. The palace, no matter how inconvenient or claustrophobic, had to be projected as paradise. Privacy barely existed. Even in their most intimate moments, royals were surrounded. Servants didn't knock. They entered. Advisors lingered. Guards stood at doors. Nothing was truly personal. Letters could be read. conversations overheard, and even solitude had limits. A monarch spending too much time alone might be labeled unstable or suspect. Windows looked out over courtyards, not open fields. The view from a royal chamber was often inward, onto the lives of other nobles, other servants, other guests. Seeing the horizon was a rare luxury. Most days, what lay beyond the castle remained distant, like a rumor, and the rooms themselves weren't soft. Beds were raised and narrow, built more for posture than rest. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers, but always firm. Blankets were layered, but heavy and scratchy. The idea of comfort as we know it today, cushions, quiet, softness, was nearly absent. Palaces weren't designed for ease. They were built to impress and to last. Decoration was a language. Walls weren't just painted, they were covered with stories. Tapestries depicted battles, legends, religious visions. Each piece was chosen not for beauty, but for symbolism. A king with lions behind him was asserting strength. A queen with flowers was declaring purity. Even the floor patterns and ceiling beams followed meaning. Nothing was random. And still, behind all of that meaning, real people tried to live, tried to breathe. Some kings developed private hobbies, collecting books, carving wood, growing rare herbs in enclosed gardens. Queen sometimes took to embroidery, not just as a pastime, but as a way to anchor themselves. Stitch by stitch, they could control something in a world where almost nothing was theirs. Even laughter was rare. It happened, but always under watch. Jesters were permitted to entertain, but only within bounds. A joke taken too far could be fatal. Monarchs were expected to chuckle, never howl. Humor had to be safe, predictable, and ideally flattering to those in power. Time passed in repetitive loops. A royal week was a slow spiral of meals, audiences, rituals, and managed appearances. Seasons changed, but the routine did not. Feast days brought distraction, but also responsibility. Visiting nobles brought conversation, but also stress. And the days between stretched long and thin. The burden of appearance was constant. Every item of clothing, every ring, every pin in the hair had to be correct. If the queen's laces were crooked, it could mean a rift with another noble house. If the king wore the wrong seal, it might be taken as a political statement. Style wasn't expression, it was diplomacy. And so, robes were planned weeks in advance. Jewels were rotated based on recent events. Colors were coordinated, not with taste, but with treaties. A blue sash on the wrong day could offend an ambassador. A missing brooch could spark rumors of illness, pregnancy, or disgrace. Everything worn was a message. The people who managed these appearances were many. There were royal tailors, jewelers, fabric stewards, and scent masters. Each had a specific role in maintaining the image. Perfumes were not just for smell. They were layered to create identity. A royal scent was as recognizable as a voice. Lose it, and suspicion began. Even posture had rules. A king should never slouch. A queen's chin should be high, but not arrogant. Eyes should linger, but not stare. Hands should remain visible, knees together, feet at a slight angle. Some of these expectations were enforced through training from childhood. Others were whispered corrections in the halls. Guests were judged harshly. A noble who bowed too deeply might be seen as desperate. One who bowed too shallow risked offense. Gift-giving followed layers of complexity. How much, when, how it was wrapped, what materials were used. Even the speed with which a gift was accepted told a story. Inside the palace, every moment was a kind of performance, a silent play with no breaks, no rehearsal, and no option to leave the stage. Royals were actors, the castle their theater, and the court their audience. But unlike a play, this one had no ending, only repetition. And yet, outside the palace walls, rumors bloomed. The common folk heard stories, some true, some twisted, of what life was like behind the gates. They imagined endless wine, music, fire-lit banquets. Few believed the silence, the cold, or the watching eyes. To them, the palace was magic, and like all magic, it concealed its price. Some kings tried to escape it, not through rebellion, but through building new palaces, summer residences, hunting lodges. These offered slight freedom, brief relief, but the rituals always followed. The crown traveled with them, and with it, the weight. For queens, the burden was often heavier. Men could retreat into war, into governance, into debate. But women of the court had fewer outlets. Their movements were monitored even more closely. A glance, a word, a silence. Everything was interpreted. That's why some turned to patronage, supporting artists, writers, or churches, as a way to leave a mark that wasn't just embroidered into a gown. The deeper one looks into royal life, the clearer it becomes. The palace was a beautifully designed prison, not built of iron bars, but of expectation, duty, image, and the walls weren't meant to keep people out. They were meant to hold someone in. The deeper the crown sat on the royal head, the heavier the pressure to pass it on. In medieval courts, legacy wasn't just an idea, it was an obsession. Bloodlines mattered more than accomplishments. A king who expanded his territory was remembered, but not as fondly as the one who secured a clean succession. To die without an heir wasn't simply a tragedy, it was a failure that could unmake a dynasty. And so, the quiet corridors of the palace were filled with an invisible tension. Behind every decision, every alliance, every glance across the banquet hall, lay one looming question. Who will carry on the name? Princes were raised not just to inherit thrones, but to preserve history. From the moment they could walk, they were reminded of who had walked before them. Paintings lined the halls, long faces of serious ancestors looking down from darkened frames. Tapestries told stories of great battles, heroic deeds, founding myths. The message was clear. Your life is not your own. You are a continuation of something ancient, something sacred. Names were recycled with care. A new prince was rarely given a new name. Instead, he became another Henry, another Charles, another Louis. The number changed, but the expectations did not. He was meant to resemble, to recall, to reinforce. And if the name came with a great legacy, the burden was even heavier. Imagine being 10 years old and constantly compared to a grandfather you never met, but whose victories were memorized by your tutors. For queens, legacy was more delicate and more dangerous. While kings ruled, queens secured the future through birth. A queen who failed to produce an heir was often cast aside, politely at first, then publicly, then permanently, and even if she bore children, she had to bear the right ones. Sons, preferably, healthy, preferably. Male heirs calmed the kingdom. Daughters stirred nervous chatter. In some cases, a royal woman who gave birth to multiple daughters in a row might be accused of sin, or worse, witchcraft. Her position at court grew uncertain. Her influence shrank. Her silence became expected. Children born to the throne were not cradled for long. They were assigned tutors, mentors, etiquette instructors. They were watched, studied, tested. Their handwriting, their table manners, their posture, every sign of intelligence or grace was recorded. A prince who asked too many questions could be seen as clever or suspicious. A princess who stayed too quiet might be praised for modesty or condemned for dullness. There was no right way to grow up in royal blood, only rules to follow. And yet, despite all this preparation, many heirs failed. Some died young, others rebelled. Some simply collapsed under the weight of what they were meant to become. Their portraits were painted anyway, their names added to family trees, their short lives folded into legend. To prevent this, kings planned carefully. Treaties were written to secure marriages with distant houses. Land was promised, dowries negotiated, inheritance mapped like a chessboard. But history had its own ideas. Plagues struck without warning. Assassinations ended bloodlines in a single night. Civil wars shattered careful legacies in a week. The fear of forgetting was powerful. That's why royals commissioned chronicles, paid monks to write flattering biographies, and built monuments with their names carved deep into the stone. Memory had to be maintained, because the opposite of legacy wasn't death, it was erasure. Some monarchs even staged their own stories before they died. They scripted tomb inscriptions, commissioned final portraits, dictated how they would be remembered. A few even faked virtues in their final years. Suddenly generous, suddenly pious, hoping to shift the narrative. And sometimes it worked. A cruel king who died with grace could be rewritten as wise. A weak ruler who built a chapel might be remembered as devout. But not every royal had the chance to shape their story. Many were forgotten almost immediately, buried without great ritual, their names fading from memory within a generation. Some castles still bear their initials, carved into beams or bricks, now barely visible. Some tombs remain unvisited. Some stories never made it past the parchment. And so, legacy became not just a hope, but a fear that after all the ceremonies, the garments, the portraits, the battles and feasts, nothing would last, that the crown would pass, but the name would vanish. That's why some kings became obsessed with monuments, towers, statues, coins, cathedrals, anything that would outlast their body, something someone would see centuries later and say, he was here. The irony, of course, is that many of these monuments crumbled. Statues were pulled down, coins melted, cathedrals burned, and yet a letter written in the margin of a book, a name scratched into the side of a desk, a forgotten lullaby hummed by a queen to a child. These survived, scattered like seeds in the wind, because legacy isn't only built by power. Sometimes it's built by presence. A royal child laughing in a courtyard. A moment of silence during a coronation. A glance between siblings just before a war. These are not carved in stone, but they are felt, and sometimes they last longer than crowns. For royalty, love was never the goal. The marriage of kings and queens in medieval times was a quiet war disguised as ceremony, a subtle battlefield where territories, treaties, and family names collided beneath veils and vows. And unlike most wars, this one began with wine, gifts, and scripted smiles. In the corridors of medieval power, a royal wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a negotiation sealed with rings. Princes and princesses were rarely allowed to marry for affection. Their futures were traded long before they reached adulthood. By the time a noble child learned to write, letters were already being exchanged with foreign courts, proposing potential matches. At first glance, these arrangements looked elegant. Two thrones, uniting through matrimony, with promises of peace and mutual prosperity. But underneath, things were delicate. A wrong word in a contract could start a feud. A misunderstanding about a dowry might end in blood. Royal families wrote love stories with ink and threat, and so, behind every royal marriage, there were layers of caution. Each side sent representatives, ambassadors, bishops, translators, to discuss terms in private chambers, often for years. Gifts were exchanged early to build trust. Gold plates, fine cloth, even exotic animals. These gifts weren't tokens of generosity. They were signals. Here is what we're willing to offer. Here is what we expect in return. Eventually, the couple would meet, though not always. In some cases, they were married by proxy. One stood at the altar, the other represented by a noble holding a glove, a sword, or simply a written document. The ceremony was performed, the alliance sealed, and the couple, they might not meet for months or years. When they did finally meet, expectations were high. Both had been raised to perform, to bow, to smile, to repeat sacred phrases in unfamiliar languages. The bride might be just 14. The groom, barely older. They stood together, dressed in silks that pinched, in shoes that ached, surrounded by guests watching their every breath. The journey to the new home was part of the test. A queen consort, leaving her country, had to say goodbye to everything she knew. She crossed borders, escorted by soldiers and servants, stepping carefully to avoid scandal, sickness, or sabotage. Sometimes, the moment she passed into new territory, she was stripped of all personal belongings. Her clothes were burned, her letters taken. She was redressed in the colors of her new house, reborn in politics, but erased as a person. Upon arrival, the introductions began, not to her new husband, who might already be known by rumor, but to the court, to the other women, to the mother-in-law, to the servants who would now watch her sleep. She was foreign, an outsider, and everything she did would be compared, not just to local customs, but to the queen she replaced. The early months were critical. If she smiled too little, she was cold. Too much, she was unserious. If she spoke too freely, she was bold. Too quietly, she was hiding something. Her accent was noted. Her table manners judged. Even the way she prayed could be suspicious. Pregnancy was expected almost immediately. A queen who produced an heir quickly secured her place. One who did not face whispers. There were herbs and rituals said to increase fertility, but no guarantee. And every month, without a child, increased the tension. In time, some queens were blamed, accused of sin, of secret illnesses, of failing their role. And what of the husbands? Princes and kings were expected to be respectful, but not necessarily faithful. Affairs were tolerated, sometimes even arranged, as long as they remained discreet. The queen's task was to endure, not object. If she complained, she was difficult. If she remained silent, she was complicit. The balance was nearly impossible. When royal marriages failed, the kingdom felt it. Tension spread through the court. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with concern. Sometimes, wars began over divorces. One misplaced phrase in a letter could unravel years of diplomacy. Even private arguments echoed through corridors until they reached distant lands. And yet, some royal couples learned to adapt, not necessarily to love each other, but to work together, to appear united, to raise heirs, attend ceremonies, and survive. In rare cases, affection did grow, slowly, like moss on stone. But that was the exception, not the rule. Children born of these unions were reminders of treaties. Their names often honored both sides. A daughter named after a foreign grandmother, a son carrying the name of a distant ally. These choices mattered. They weren't sentimental, they were strategic. And when the children grew, the pattern repeated. Another round of negotiations, another generation of young faces dressed for portraits, promised to people they hadn't met. The cycle continued. Sometimes, the marriages ended in quiet distance. The couple lived in separate wings, or even in different castles. Officially, they were still united. Publicly, they dined together. But in truth, they barely spoke, and the court adjusted, servants carrying messages between spouses, avoiding awkward encounters in corridors, pretending not to notice. Other times, things unraveled dramatically. A scandal, an accusation, a public trial, even executions. Betrayal was the ultimate shame, and monarchs responded harshly. Adultery was punishable by death, though rarely applied to men. Queens accused of infidelity were often imprisoned, exiled, or worse. But most royal marriages didn't explode. They faded. Two people, bound by politics, living side by side in silence. And the world watched, always, because the success or failure of one marriage could shift the balance of an entire continent. The question was never, do they love each other? It was, can this marriage keep the peace? Can it stop a war? Can it produce heirs? Can it last long enough for another alliance to take its place? In this way, love became a luxury, affection, an accident, and marriage. Marriage was the throne's most delicate tool. Royalty did not rule alone. Behind every crown, every quiet nod at a banquet, every whispered decision in a private chamber, there stood a small army of servants, not soldiers, not advisors, but the invisible class of people who made the performance of monarchy possible, those who dressed the king, arranged the queen's jewels, poured the wine, swept the ash from the fireplaces, and disappeared before being noticed. The medieval palace was not powered by machines. It moved on footsteps, soft ones, hundreds of them, every day. The hands that folded royal letters were not gloved in silk. They were dry, ink-stained, and usually trembling, because a mistake meant disgrace. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the pages, the scullery maids, the firekeepers. They worked before dawn, slept in corners, and often never saw the monarchs they served. Above them, the footmen and valets, men trusted with shirts, boots, hair, breath. Then, the ladies-in-waiting and chamberwomen, who watched the queen's moods more closely than anyone else. And then there were the bedchamber servants, the most intimate and the most dangerous. These were the ones who stood closest when royalty was most vulnerable. They saw the royal body without its robes. They heard what was muttered in pain, in dreams, in frustration. They were trained to be invisible, but everyone knew. They knew everything. That's why, in many courts, bedchamber roles were highly political. Nobles fought to place their own people close to the monarch, not for comfort, but for control. A servant who dressed the king could pass on rumors. A lady-in-waiting who held the queen's mirror could suggest an alliance. Servants became spies, and silence became a weapon. Trust was rare, suspicion constant. Sometimes, the queen's chambermaids were swapped without notice, new faces appearing, old ones vanishing. Loyalty had to be tested. Notes were planted, mistakes watched. Every spilled drink, every forgotten cloak, every delay in drawing the curtains could be a message or a threat. Royal households became mazes of whispers. A cook might be bribed for information. A messenger might read a sealed letter before delivering it. Some servants kept journals, not for themselves, but for noble patrons who wanted updates. Entire sections of the palace became unofficial intelligence networks, and everyone pretended not to notice. Some monarchs responded with rules, codes of conduct, background checks. In some courts, servants were required to swear loyalty not once, but yearly. In others, they were rotated from post to post to prevent familiarity. And still, secrets leaked. They always did. Because the greatest secret of all was this: no king or queen truly ruled alone. Behind every royal decision stood dozens of eyes, ears, and hands. Unseen, unheard, unremembered. Meals, for example, required layers of preparation. Before a royal feast, tasters sampled every dish. But those tasters were not anonymous. They were carefully chosen, sometimes family, sometimes servants, with long records of loyalty. One wrong taste, one stomach ache, and suspicion spread like fire. The man who poured the wine had power. So did the woman who arranged the queen's bath oils. So did the boy who lit the king's candle each evening. Each had access. Each had opportunity, and everyone knew it. That's why even kindness could be dangerous. A royal who became too friendly with a servant risked appearing weak. A queen who cried in front of her maid gave away more than emotion. She gave away control. So most royalty learned to perform, even in private, to wear the crown in every glance, every breath. And the servants learned to watch, not out of cruelty, out of survival. The mood of a court could shift in an hour. A frown at breakfast could mean someone's dismissal by supper. A new alliance could end a lifelong post. So the smart ones stayed quiet, observed, waited. Some rose. A few, through silence and service, gained influence. A valet who spoke little, listened well, and obeyed precisely might end up advising on small matters. A lady in waiting with perfect posture and perfect memory might be asked to arrange an unofficial meeting. These were the exceptions, but they existed, and they knew power wasn't always in the throne. Sometimes it was in the corridor. Some of the most influential moments in medieval courts happened not in official chambers, but in passageways. A servant might mention a detail in passing, knowing it would reach the right ear. A subtle hesitation while handing a robe might communicate more than a written report. Influence didn't always come from speaking. It came from knowing when not to. And then there were the spies, who weren't servants at all, but nobles in disguise. Members of lesser houses took positions as stewards, clerks, or scribes, not for salary, but for surveillance. They watched, they listened, and they reported back to patrons higher up the ladder. Whole careers were built on quiet observation. The presence of so many watchers meant that truth became flexible. A queen's sigh could mean she was tired, or bored, or plotting, depending on who told the story. And once a version of an event took root, once someone said, "The king looked angry this morning," that version became more powerful than fact. Reputation moved faster than action. To protect themselves, monarchs developed routines, patterns that couldn't be misread. They greeted the same people in the same way. They walked at the same pace. They ate the same meals on the same days, not because they liked order, but because it left less room for speculation. Routine became armor. Still, servants adapted. They learned to read between the gestures. A slower blink, a long pause before standing. The smallest change became a hint, and the court lived on hints. Some servants became masters at interpreting silence, and those servants became valuable, not officially, but invisibly. Of course, not all servants stayed loyal. Some sold information. Some betrayed their masters outright. Occasionally, a servant would disappear, quietly dismissed or quietly eliminated. Stories spread of poisoners, of hidden letters, of confessions whispered on deathbeds, but nothing was ever confirmed. That was the nature of palace life. You never knew which silence was safety and which was strategy. Beneath the opulence, beneath the ceremony, the court was a machine, and servants were the gears. If one broke, another was inserted. But the system never stopped, and the monarch, though seated at the top, was only partly in control. For the common people outside the walls, servants were invisible. They imagined kings sitting in solitary rooms, making grand decisions. They didn't picture the hands behind the curtains, the eyes in the corner, the whispers between steps. But those hands, Those eyes, those whispers, they were the true memory of the palace. When the king died, it wasn't just the crown that remembered him. It was the man who brushed his hair, the woman who tied his boots, the boy who warmed his gloves before a winter ride. They carried his image, not as legend, but as habit. And when the crown passed on, the servants remained, watching the next monarch rise, repeating the process. Another face, another name, the same system, because the palace was not just built of stone, it was built of silence, and silence never sleeps. Every crown cast a shadow, and in that shadow, fear grew. The higher a monarch rose, the more they feared the fall, not just by war or illness, but from within. In medieval courts, threats didn't always wear armor or wave banners. Some came dressed in velvet, smiling across the banquet table. Others came with letters, unsigned and sealed in haste. Betrayal was not an exception in royal life. It was an expectation. Behind the walls of the castle, the most dangerous game was often the quietest. Plots were rarely shouted. They whispered through hallways, disguised as prayers, passed between sleeves, hinted in poetry. No monarch could afford to feel safe, even among family, perhaps especially among family. Loyalty had limits. Brothers betrayed brothers. Sons rose against fathers. Queens conspired with cousins. A noble with too much charm became a suspect. One with too little became a threat. The line between advisor and enemy blurred daily. Everyone wanted something, and everyone was watching. That's why many monarchs lived with a kind of elegant paranoia, not panic, not public fear, but a low, constant alertness, a carefulness in every sentence, a weighing of every look. Even a toast from a trusted friend might be sniffed twice before drinking, and meals were tasted not for pleasure, but for survival. Guards were rotated, chambers inspected, locks tested nightly. But the most dangerous threats didn't come with swords. They came with paper, a letter slipped under a door, a forged decree, a secret message, delivered by a servant who didn't ask questions. Accusations spread like fog. You couldn't hold them, but they clung to everything. Once someone was suspected of treason, the air around them changed. Nobles stepped back. Friends hesitated. Servants bowed more deeply, but spoke less. Guilt didn't have to be proven. It only had to be whispered. And so, monarchs created systems of protection that often became systems of fear. Councils were formed not just to advise, but to monitor. Letters were copied and archived. Spies reported not only on enemies, but on allies. It wasn't about trust, it was about control. But even control had its limits, because plotting didn't always happen in secret. Sometimes it happened in daylight, cloaked as flattery. A noble might offer a generous gift, not out of respect, but as a warning. Look how much I can give. Imagine what I could take. Royalty learned to read these gestures, to interpret excess as potential threat. In some cases, monarchs responded preemptively. A baron too powerful? Strip his lands. A cousin too charismatic? Send him abroad. A courtier too well liked? Promote him to a distant, thankless post. It was a dance of influence, and the steps were taught by experience and fear. But sometimes fear struck first, and punishment followed second. Executions were not always about guilt. They were about example. A noble beheaded in the square reminded the others to stay quiet. A public trial, even if rigged, gave the illusion of justice. Confessions were extracted through pressure or pain or promises, and even those who were innocent often admitted guilt just to stop the waiting. Towers became prisons. Rooms once used for guests were turned into holding cells. Some nobles spent years locked away without trial, forgotten by everyone except the guards who brought their meals. Others vanished completely. No announcement, no explanation. Their names were erased from records, their portraits removed from halls. And yet, despite the fear, despite the risk, the plots never stopped, because power attracts ambition, and ambition doesn't sleep. There were nobles who believed they could rule better, clergy who believed the monarch had offended heaven, merchants who wanted freer trade, cousins who wanted revenge for slights 3 generations old. The reasons varied, but the desire was always the same: to move closer to the throne. Not every conspiracy aimed at the king. Some sought to influence him, to push policies, marriages, alliances, a quiet bribe, a flattering letter, a dinner invitation that turned into a demand. Influence was currency, and everyone wanted to spend it. Some monarchs embraced the chaos. They let the factions grow, let them fight each other. A court divided was easier to control. If no one group had all the power, the crown remained safe. But it was a dangerous game. Stir the pot too hard, and it boiled over. Other rulers tried to unify their courts, to force loyalty through reward, titles, land, marriages. But this too came with risks. A noble elevated too quickly created resentment. One overlooked too long became bitter. Balance was fragile, and it shifted with every rumor. The queen's favor could tilt alliances. A smile at a banquet might signal rising influence. A dance refused could start a feud. Jealousy was everywhere, because in royal courts, position meant everything. To be close to the monarch meant power. To be far meant danger. And so, everyone leaned in. They watched. They whispered. They waited. For a mistake. For a death. For a shift in the wind. Because no crown sat still. And those who wanted it were always closer than they appeared. In the medieval world, childhood was not innocence. Not for royalty. A prince was not simply a boy. A princess was not simply a girl. From the moment they drew their first breath, royal children were treated as vessels of politics, symbols of alliances, and tools for survival. Childhood was not a time of discovery. It was a time of rehearsal. Royal infants were born into ceremony. The birth itself was often a public event, or at least witnessed. A queen in labor might be surrounded by noble women, priests, midwives, and guards. Privacy was forbidden. The kingdom needed proof that the child was truly royal, truly alive, and truly male. If the baby cried, bells rang. If it didn't, prayers began. The child was quickly baptized, swaddled, and presented to a court already speculating on its future. Would he be strong? Would she be beautiful? Would he live past 5? would she be useful in marriage, but once the spectacle ended, the mother was often removed from the child's life. Wet nurses were assigned. Maids dressed and fed the infant. A governess might oversee the nursery. The queen, recovering, re-entering court life, was expected to return to her public role. Affection was a private indulgence, and indulgence was weakness. By the time a royal child could walk, they were already part of state strategy. Boys learned posture before language. They were taught to bow, to hold a goblet, to sit still at banquets. Girls were shown how to smile without showing teeth, how to lower their gaze, how to remain composed while being ignored. Play was permitted, but structured. A wooden sword for the prince, a miniature harp for the princess. Every toy was a message, every game a lesson. Hide and seek was less about fun and more about learning control. The royal child learned early. Someone is always watching. At the age of 7, things changed. 7 was the age of reason. The prince was taken from the nursery and handed to tutors. Philosophy, religion, Latin, history. Not for understanding, but for imitation. He memorized speeches written centuries ago. He practiced signing his name until it looked like his grandfather's. He was trained to sound like a king, even if he didn't understand what he said. The princess, too, entered a new world. She learned embroidery, manners, and silence. Her tutors taught her the family tree, not as history, but as destiny. She was a thread in a great fabric, and she would be sewn wherever the crown needed her. She might be promised to a foreign prince before she could write her own name. Some children resisted. They wept. They froze during ceremonies. They laughed at the wrong moment, and those moments were not forgotten. A single misstep could follow a royal child for life. He cried during his father's coronation. She spilled wine at the betrothal feast. These became part of the legend, or the warning. Royal siblings were rarely close. They were separated by rank. The heir received the best of everything: tutors, rooms, privileges. The others received expectations. They were spares, bargaining chips, and they knew it. Love, when it existed, had to be hidden. Two brothers whispering jokes might be seen as plotting. A sister defending her brother might be accused of favoring a faction. Even games could become political if the wrong, noble child lost. And so, most learned to smile and say nothing. As teenagers, princes were often sent away to fight, to govern, or simply to learn from other courts. These departures were ceremonies themselves. A prince rode out with gifts and guards. He returned, taller, changed, more like the men who ruled. But what he learned depended on who hosted him. In one court, he might find philosophy. In another, manipulation. Princesses were moved too, but to marry, sometimes across the sea, sometimes into silence. A girl who once sang in her mother's garden became a stranger in another palace, speaking another language, answering to another name. Her letters were read before they were sent. Her body watched for signs of pregnancy. Her voice softened until it disappeared. Some royal children rebelled. They wrote poetry. They painted in secret. They broke rules quietly, scribbling jokes in the margins of prayer books. One prince kept a bird and refused to have it caged. A princess wore a dress the wrong color on purpose. These small rebellions were not noticed by everyone, but the servants saw and remembered. Other royal children became exactly what the court wanted: polished, graceful, empty. They stood perfectly still at ceremonies. They spoke only when asked. They gave no opinion, showed no preference, made no errors. They were praised and forgotten. A few, very few, escaped, not by running away, but by hiding within their roles. A prince who became a monk, a princess who vanished into marriage and never returned to court. Their names fell from history, not in disgrace, but in quiet disappearance, because the greatest danger of royal childhood was not assassination. It was becoming exactly what was expected, and nothing more. By the end of their lives, many kings and queens had more gold, more land, and more people saying yes to them than they could ever count. But beneath the layers of velvet, beyond the ceremonies and castles, behind the crown itself, many of them shared one private thought, unspoken but quietly felt, that they had never been truly free. Royalty, for all its symbols of power, lived within walls tighter than any prison. Every gesture was expected, every word recorded, every moment observed. From birth to death, their lives were not entirely their own. They belonged to the throne. A crown was not a hat. It was a role, a mask, a burden. It wasn't taken off at the end of the day and left on a table. It stayed on, in posture, in silence, in the gaze of others. Even while asleep, the weight remained. To rule did not mean to decide. Not freely. Decisions were made through councils, alliances, pressures from the church, the nobles, the foreign powers watching from a distance. A king who ruled too strongly was feared. One who ruled too gently was mocked. The art of monarchy was never doing what you wanted. It was choosing how to do what was necessary without losing the illusion that it was your choice. Some rulers understood this early. They mastered performance. They learned how to speak with authority, when to nod, when to stay silent. Their success came not from personal strength, but from understanding the theater of power. They became actors in their own lives, delivering lines written by tradition, speaking in rhythms set by history. Others never accepted it. They pushed back. They tried to change rules, challenge advisors, love who they weren't supposed to, walk where they weren't meant to walk. And one by one, they were corrected by exile, by poison, by loneliness. Some disappeared into illness, others into history, but what remained, always, was the structure, the throne, the crown, the expectation, and the people watching, because royalty, more than anything else, was about being seen. To be royal meant to exist as a symbol, not as a person, not entirely. They were the face on the coin, the hand on the sword, the body in the painting, the story, not the storyteller. And as history moved forward, the names remained, but the voices faded. Few know what these monarchs truly thought, what they feared, what they dreamed of when the fire burned low and no one else was near. Their portraits show stillness, their letters, formality, their lives, direction, but not depth. And that may be the final cost of being royal in the medieval world. You are remembered, but not known.